My name's Liz Weaver. I am the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I am very pleased to be joining you today. Welcome everyone to the Intersections and Innovations webinar. I think this will be a very lively discussion with my colleagues, Bob Wyatt and Dr. Susan Phillips from McMaster University. Before we get underway, we want to begin by acknowledging that each of us is meeting on Indigenous lands, and that as settlers, we're grateful for this opportunity to meet. And we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of the land. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. And the land that I'm joining you from is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to care and steward for the land around the Great Lakes. It's also, I think, particularly important to acknowledge that we are a day away from the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and that's a day for all of us to reflect on the relationship between settlers and Indigenous nations and some of that tragic history that we've had in Canada. And so I welcome you to reflect tomorrow on all of that. As we're going through today in the webinar, I wanted to just identify a couple of highlights. We're recording the webinar, and we welcome you to share it with your colleagues. In a couple of days, we'll send you a link to the webinar recording and the slides and the resources. We're keeping everyone except our speakers mute so that we can ensure good sound quality. At all points during the webinar, if there's a comment that you want to share or a question and answer or a question that you have, please put those into the appropriate locations on the Zoom client. There's a Q&A box, and we'll pull your questions at the end of the webinar and post those to Bob and Susan, and they'll do the rest to answer those questions. We've got about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar to spend time on your questions. Please also reach out to Connor if you have any technical challenges. Connor is here to support us during the course of the webinar. So I'd like to begin now by introducing you to my colleagues on the webinar. I was really excited when both Bob and Susan agreed to join Tamarack in providing this webinar today. So I'm going to introduce you first to Bob Wyatt, and then I will introduce you to Susan Phillips. So Bob Wyatt joined the Muttart Foundation in 1989 after a career in journalism, public relations, and government relations. Over the years, his primary foci have become capacity building of Canada's charitable sector and the regulation of charities. He has served on the boards of Imagine Canada, Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, and a variety of charities in the Edmonton and Alberta and the province of Alberta. His service to the sector has been recognized by an honorary doctorate of law degree from Carleton University, as well as Alberta's Centennial Medal and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. So welcome, Bob. Dr. Susan Phillips is a professor, School of Public Policy and Administration, Carleton University, and director of its Masters of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program, Canada's only graduate program in this field. She serves as editor-in-chief of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, the leading international journal on nonprofits, philanthropy, and civil society. Susan's research focuses on place-based philanthropy, public policy, regulation of charities, and nonprofits. She's a co-editor of the Rutledge Companion to Philanthropy, 2016, and is currently co-editing a book on disaster philanthropy and leading a study team exploring the question, what makes charities more resilient? What makes some charities more resilient than others? Her work in advancing research and nonprofit studies has been recognized by a Distinguished Service Award from the Association of Nonprofit Social Economy Research, and in public management by the Canadian Association of Programs in Public Administration. So you can tell by those brief bios, our speakers today come with a lot of commitment to the voluntary sector in Canada and a lot of knowledge and experience in the voluntary sector in Canada. So I'm really pleased to be joined by both of you, Bob and Susan, for the webinar today.
Thank you, Liz. It's a delight to be here, and Susan and I have done a variety of dog and pony shows over the years, and I have no doubt that we will correct and supplement one another as necessary.
Thank you, Liz.
Great. Okay, so we're going to start off. We have a number of questions that will prime the pump of this conversation, but we're going to start off with this one to you, Bob. Because we know that the Muttart Foundation and your own personal history, you have this kind of passion for the nonprofit and voluntary sector in Canada. But what was the interest of the Muttart Foundation in making this investment in the development of this publication?
Well, as we were approaching the 65th anniversary of the Muttart Foundation. And our board decided that we should do something to celebrate that milestone. And when we started looking at ideas, one of the things that had struck me is that in all of the courses and sessions and other educational pursuits I've undertaken, whenever we were given readings, they were from the US, England, occasionally Australia. And Susan and I had a conversation about this, and I had at one point was one of Susan's students, a period for which she's still getting therapy, and said, we've never told our story. People like, how do we understand ourselves without some basis? And so I went back to the board and said, here's this wacko idea. Why don't we tell the story of the sector? And do it in a way that is accessible and that engages academics and practitioners, sometimes working together, which was an interesting feat. And following our board's approval, I went to Susan and said, okay, we'd like to do this. So how would you like to head this project? And thankfully for us and for the sector, she said yes.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think it's been such an interesting collaborative partnership between the two of you. So I have this, as I looked through the chapters in Intersections and Innovations, there's part of it that looks at the history and the roots of Canada's voluntary sector, and then part of it that looks at the current and some of it future facing. So what did you uncover as you connected with authors and you thought about the history and roots? Maybe we'll start with you, Susan, and then invite Bob in to answer this question as well.
Well, we explicitly wanted a good history chapter because I don't think we tell the history of this sector very well, or we have a very simplified narrative, and perhaps two narratives that don't ring true. And therefore, we engaged a historian. We tend to help tell the history in one of two ways. The first is the US version, because as Bob said, we're all reading the US literature. And that history is that in the 1830s, the French aristocrat and philosopher de Tocqueville came to North America and saw this nation of joiners. And it is that spirit of voluntarism that has animated the whole sector over the years. That's a great story, and it's very important for volunteerism. But that's not what happened in Canada. De Tocqueville did come to Lower Canada, to Quebec, and he saw a very happy French population. But more than that, he saw the dominance of the state. He didn't see much of a charitable sector. So we on one hand, adopt a US narrative. On the other, we tell this simple story of first there was the church, and then there was the state, and then there were charities. So we enlisted Dominique Marshall, who's a very highly respected historian at Carleton, I'm pleased to say. And first of all, while she recognized and sets it in the context of really strong Indigenous nations and communities that had long existed and had thriving societies and traditions, but she's focused more on the colonial legacy. And that was several things that has left us as baggage. One is that it was a culture of entitlements and responsibilities regulated by law that left a mark on how we view charity and our responsibilities about charity that exists today. The second is, again, a very strong public sector and trust in the public sector, which may mean that how we see the charitable nonprofit sector versus the state, sometimes I think those boundaries aren't very clear. And of course, there was the presence of religion, but there was also the emergence quite early of broadly based, change-oriented coalitions, and women tended to be leaders in many of those. But it created early on the scope for nonprofits and charities really to act as pioneers in fields that the state hadn't yet occupied or that the private sector hadn't. So we wanted to start with the message that sometimes you need to look back to look forward.
Bob, what might you weigh in? How might you weigh in here?
So I guess there are a couple of things that struck me in looking at the first few chapters of the book and the history. I mean, when I read Dominique's chapter, a couple of things struck me. One, and this is particularly relevant on the eve of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, is we have some things, we as a sector have some things to answer for. Our history may have been imbued with good intentions, but the results in some cases have been anything but. I come from a province where there is, as you know, Liz, currently a bunch of conversations going on about the foreign funding of charities in Canada. And it was nice in Dominique's chapter to realize that the foreign funding of Canadian charities goes back about 5 or 6 centuries. And this is not really a new initiative. And finally, I wrote the chapter on regulation, and I went back and looked at some of the debates. So we had charities in the country predating Confederation, but it wasn't until 1966, 67 that we started up a system to register them. And it was fascinating to look back at the debates at that time and understand what a light regulatory touch was being conceived by the federal government of the day. That, of course, is not what's happened in the 60 years since then. But we've got, as Susan said, my wife is an historian, and she keeps reminding me that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And I fear that if we don't take some lessons from our past, that we are going to repeat some of the problems, some of the bad actions we've taken over the years.
So it's interesting as I listen to both of you, Susan, what I heard from you is this kind of relationship between, you know, the charitable sector and the state, and how that has not only had a relationship in the past, but it certainly is influencing, you know, the relationship that we have right now. And I hear what you're saying, Bob, about the shifting of the regulatory framework. So some of these roots have really influenced kind of our current state. What would you say, Susan, is the biggest thread of influence, in your opinion, into the current state of the voluntary sector in Canada?
I think it's the lack of awareness and understanding in both the part of the state governments at all levels and the public. It's always fascinated me that there's never been really seemed to be a political opportunity in understanding the role of the sector as employers, as community builders, as all of the things that the sector does. So for me, one of the greatest challenge is the relative invisibility of the sector compared to what it does.
And Bob, what for you is that kind of history that you bring into the current state that we?
I'm going to follow up Susan's story, and I'll tell an anecdote. I was at a foundations conference one time in the US, and we were talking, as conversations have gone on for years, about what would happen if there were no voluntary sector. And one of the women I was sitting beside said, we did the study, we commissioned a university in our state to do a study about the impact of the sector. And if there were no volunteers, if there was no voluntary sector, what do you think the biggest problem would be? And I said, well, I assume healthcare or disaster services. And she said, fire protection. She said, more than half of our state is served by volunteer firefighters. And without them, we would have an absolute disaster in the making. So I agree with Susan. The sector remains invisible. And we're particularly invisible at policy level tables. I sat down one time with a cabinet minister in the then provincial government who was talking about changing a program that would affect tens of thousands of people in the province. And I said, the decision to make those changes is obviously government's, but what I would encourage you to do is to involve some of the charities that actually deliver the program in discussing the policy and in discussing the design of the program. And he said, why would I do that? I said, because they are the people who know your clients. And he could not get his head around it. And I'm not sure we've done a great job as a sector in helping government understand we are part of the solution to the problems they are trying to address. We are not just a service delivery arm of government.
Such interesting points that you both raise. And I think food for thought. I'm in one of those communities, Bob, where the firefighters are voluntary. I mean, Hamilton is a big city, but I live in a rural part of Hamilton and we have our volunteer fire department. And you know that when there's an accident, they're all rushing to the main station and then going out to respond. So, yeah.
Well, Liz, Hamilton is my hometown. And I remember as when I was in high school, I was asked to sit on a city council committee looking at planning. And this was long before my involvement, other than as a volunteer from time to time in various organizations. And I learned a great deal about how much the city of Hamilton has always relied on voluntary organizations. And that ranged from things at Stelco and DeFasco that were primarily around service to often widows and families of deceased steelworkers, to all of the heritage stuff and cultural stuff that occurs within the city. And I could not get people off the question of what do we do about development permits, to talk about how do we engage this group of people who want to make Hamilton a better place. And I think in Canada, we're still having those discussions, and that's a significant number of years later.
And it's not just about underappreciating the role of volunteers. I mean, think about the Canada Student Grant Program, that a government could imagine that you could place 100,000 students over a 2-month period during the pandemic in charities and nonprofits, that they could easily absorb them. Or think of how when the benefits, the subsidies for COVID were created, and it initially failed to dawn on government that charities are employers.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, no, I think both of you are Those are really interesting and important threads that you bring forward. So we've talked a little bit about the history and the linking of the history to where we are in our current, but touched a little bit on some of the current. But what are some of those challenges that that the authors of the various chapters highlighted? What are some of the ones that you want to bring forward? And maybe we'll start with you, Bob, and then bring you and Susan into this conversation as well. So Bob, what are some of the challenges?
I think there are a variety of challenges that are addressed in the book, from governance to fundraising, to use of volunteers, excuse me, to the role of earned income opportunities and the risks associated with those opportunities. The biggest challenge I see right now is an ability to look beyond tomorrow into the years ahead. So we have a number of people who, for really good reasons, want to make changes that will fundamentally change what we have understood charities to be and do in Canada. And they want to do it sort of on the back of another legislative change. And it's not clear to me that we have given enough thought to the impacts of those changes if they were to be adopted. And the question of whether we might be solving some of today's problems and ignoring the crises of tomorrow or next week or next year. I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and at various times I have heard that the world was coming to a complete and utter end. Around Y2K, that was going to be the biggest crisis society and the sector had ever faced. The global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was the greatest crisis that would ever be faced. The last 18 months have demonstrated to us how health issues can be a significant problem. But I've also have a number of scientists and charities telling me the world is going to burn up by 2050, which seems to me to be a rather important issue for us to address. So we need to understand where we sit in context with a predictable future. And we need to think beyond today. And I'm not sure that we either have the fora or the leaders to start that conversation. Susan?
Interesting. Over to you, Susan.
That's exactly where I would pick up. You know, my passion is training is talent development, is training the next generation and upskilling the current one of leaders for the sector. That's the reason we created the Master of Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership. And there were demographic shifts already underway, some of a sort of tectonic shift nature, and they have been amplified and accelerated by COVID. I think we will have a significant leadership vacuum. You'll see the demographics were such that CEOs were already in the upper scale, close to, or in many cases over what might be traditional retirement age. Limited pipelines, because we haven't paid enough attention to talent development across the sector or succession planning, the need for new and different skills, so that the kind of leadership and the availability of leadership is going to be a significant issue. And couple that with a leadership that needs to be much more inclusive and representative and truly engaging of our population, which the sector hasn't done all that well. It's going to be a huge people challenge.
So it's both people, but it's also the capacity or the foresight, Bob, I'm hearing you say about kind of understanding what are the challenges that are ahead of us, and then how do we build capacity to look at things at a more systems level or more at a level where we're engaging with the complexity of the issues that we're facing. So really, really kind of interesting to hear both of your perspectives about this. And in some ways, they're in many ways they're connected, right? They're interlocking challenges that we face. If we go on to kind of thinking about right now, we're either in a pandemic or maybe exiting into this kind of post-pandemic world. What are you seeing right now as you look across the sector? You look at how the sector has responded during this really unique period of time. What are some lessons that you have learned from this, and also what you might recommend as a way of going forward? So we'll start with you again, Bob, around this.
Well, talking to someone in Alberta about whether we're exiting the pandemic is probably the wrong thing to do. But having said that, the sector certain parts of the sector have done an absolutely incredible job in helping Canada survive. And smarter people than I have said for years that if we shut down every charity in the country for one day, the country would cease to function. As one of my colleagues in New Zealand once said to me, yes, but we would spend 8 years deciding what day we were going to close down because we would have to process it. What I'm not seeing federally or in any provincial jurisdiction is the sector being engaged in helping government think through what's on the other side and how we revert to whatever the new normal is going to be, because it's going to look a whole lot different than it did. And what does, how do programs get delivered? But more importantly, what programs do we need? I mean, one of the things that, one of the pieces that I think has been ignored is because we've been so socially isolated in the last 18 months. There had been a focus building on senior isolation. And I fear that now, because everybody has been isolated or feels isolated, we're going to ignore that. And what I'm concerned about is social isolation is likely to become a bigger issue. And I'm not sure how government or the sector or corporations or all of us working together are going to address that. I think there are going to be fundamental changes in how people give. And I don't know what that's going to look like yet. We see some positive signs from Canada Helps from their 2020 results. Will that continue? I don't know. And where will the money go? We're in the midst of a debate about disbursement quota and what changes that might result in. But I think I go back to, we are challenged to take our rightful role as part of the planning for what comes next. And I don't think that we have asserted that or been persuasive enough in doing that to get that place at the table.
Susan.
Bob and I sound like we have the same script. I agree completely with that. The sector needs to be much more engaged in policy because there's some huge policy changes that will need to come. It needs much stronger and visible cross-sector leadership. It needs to be seen that can work and speak as a sector. And of course, it's diverse. Getting to same positions on many issues will be challenging, but it needs that comprehensive and way of thinking across the sector, that audacious, inventive working with government, so that the leadership not only of organizations but across the sector will be critically important, and you will soon hear more from us on that. Services are going to be reconfigured, whether from digital to the need to integrate services to figure out how they can be delivered in a more targeted way, a more place-based way that might be differentiated from one community to another. And we're going to see, we're already seeing this, but they're going to open up even more, the questions about the public responsibilities of private wealth, with growing income inequality, with wealth that has accumulated in some sectors of the population with the pandemic. So we're going to see, and I think we're going to ask more of our foundations. TARD has been on a leading edge of this. We're going to ask them to be more engaged, more systems oriented, much more involved in big problem solving. And we're going to need good data and the transfer of data and research skills to the sector and about the sector to do that.
Yeah, it seems to me, I mean, I think of Mutart and Carleton University as a unique partnership in coming together to co-create the intersections and innovations resource. But I think we need more of that, right? More of those kind of unique partnerships. And I know you reached out to a whole variety of authors, both in the academic sector and in the practitioner sector, to pull the various chapters together. And I think that that's really healthy, right? That's the notion of co-creating, co-designing, and really collaborating across different sectors. And what I've heard you both speak to as well is, how do we do that more proactively with government, with, you know, the private sector? What are those other roles that Canada's voluntary sector can play? I think, you know, maybe the last 18 months we've had our heads down responding, and now we need to put our heads back up and say, hey, there are going to be these, from what I'm hearing from both of you, there's going to be these pretty big shifts, and we have to be engaged in those conversations.
And the other piece that I would add is that we need to know more about what's happening in the sector as it's happening, rather than months or years after the fact. I mean, we will not see complete data on fundraising during 2020 until sometime in late 21 or early 22. So, and by that time, the whole world will have changed again. Mm-hmm. There are other possibilities about how we do that, and it may well be that the unique partnership that you talked about, Liz, will have some news on that in hopefully the near future.
Great. Hey, everybody that's on the call, if you have questions for Bob and for Susan about any of the points that they've raised, we have one more question to engage them in, and then we're going to open it up to your comments and your questions. So feel free to put your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box. And I know we've already got a couple waiting in the Q&A box for us, Bob and Susan, just to give you a bit of a heads up. But I want to leave on this question, which is really, you know, kind of thinking about opportunities, thinking about how organizations can position themselves, or any other advice that you might have to the folks on the call, or to folks that are engaged in this sector or in working with government, because we heard that there are some folks from government on the call, or in the private sector. You know, what do we need to be thinking about? How do we prepare ourselves?
We're emerging not only from a global pandemic, perhaps outside of Alberta, but we've seen the convergence with the racial justice movement. And this is requiring us to face up to some of the structural inequalities that have long existed, but we chose to ignore. And therefore really thinking with more of a justice lens in our philanthropy and in our work, and engaging in involving much more diverse communities, whether it's how we fund through our volunteers, through our boards and staff, and youth. Youth is going to be a big part of this, the future in terms of real change. And we've also seen during this time, in a positive side, some deep community engagement. People helped each other for the most part. And it's an opportunity to build on that for community development, community enhancement, volunteerism in new and different ways. And we have to be creative about that.
I agree with everything Susan said, and I would add a couple of other things, one of which may be surprising. We have the opportunity to reshape our future and the future of assistance to Canadians, service to Canadians in whatever, and others, in no matter what field we're in. We have the opportunity to do some transformative thinking, and consider not what next year should be like, but what role we should be playing in 2030, 2040, 2050. We also have the opportunity to restructure ourselves. And one of the opportunities that's emerged is for the ability for some charities to say, we don't need to exist anymore. Mm. We introduced a restructuring program to help charities look at what their future is. And one of the things that's got a bit of mixed reaction, frankly, is we introduced a program that said, if you make the decision that you should close down, we're prepared to help you do that in a way that respects what you've done, allows you to exit with dignity, and ensure that your clients are served by others. So I think we need to look internally as well as externally, and ideally through programs such as the master's program at Carleton, and with the work of some leaders in the sector, we can start having those longer term conversations rather than trying to respond on a day-by-day basis, because our responses will be effective for the 5 days or 18 months that they've been in place, and then they're going to become irrelevant. And I don't want the sector tossed aside when somebody decides that those solutions are now irrelevant. I want us to tell them what the solutions are for the following 18 months and for the 18 years following that.
Before we go on to the questions from the participants, I wonder, I have a question, one final question. It's not in our group, but do you think that we have the capacity to be as bold and audacious as both of you are suggesting?
Absolutely, the capacity is there. There will be new capacities that need to be harnessed to achieve that, and new ways of thinking and working together. You're not going to achieve this kind of change in a siloed way, working by subsector or by organization. It's going to be a much more integrative approach. And we know from how things get disrupted in innovation. They often get disrupted from the boundaries. They get disrupted, and innovation occurs when you bring new people, different ways of thinking, different perspectives. So it has to be some boundary breaking before you can put it together in new ways.
I agree. I agree. We not only can we be that bold and audacious, but our commitment to serve Canadians and those overseas demands that we be that bold and audacious. Alberta is moving into municipal elections in the next month because we haven't had enough elections so far this fall. And there was a group brought together to talk about what questions might be posed to a mayoral candidates forum. And one of the themes that came up is, when are you going to treat the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations the same way you treat the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce? And that's a question that I think the sector needs to use in every community, in every province, and throughout the country, and say, not only do we have skills, we have knowledge that you guys will never in a million years have. And we need to be part of developing the solutions. So yeah, we can do it. The question is, are we prepared to give up the image of being always the nice people and say, we are players? Because we have to be players. Canadians demand that we be players.
So to wrap up, I'm going to send this over to my colleague Connor to tell us a little bit about what's coming up in the future. Again, Bob and Susan, thank you. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I know that our listeners have thought so as well. So Connor, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. I just want to let everybody know about some upcoming webinars and learning opportunities here at the Tamarack Institute. The first, that we're really excited to launch our new suite of online courses. So the Foundations of Community Engagement will also be joined soon by our Foundations of Collective Impact course. So please join us for these self-directed online courses that allow you to build your engagement and collective impact toolkits at your own pace. Engage with pre-recorded videos, resources, case studies, and your own course workbook to get them. And as well, you'll receive personalized feedback during monthly small group coaching opportunities. As always, at the Tamarack Institute, we have tons of learning opportunities in the form of workshops and webinars. We encourage you all to visit our website at www.tamarackcommunity.ca to check out all of those events. And also, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, this morning, and this evening, wherever you're tuning in from. I just want to let you guys know once again that in a few days, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, as well as further learning opportunities I've just mentioned. And once again, for more of those opportunities, please visit our website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Thanks so much. See you soon.